Messiah. It's a word we throw around a lot in church. As Christians, we boldly proclaim that Jesus is the Messiah. Around Christmas, we look forward to hearing the familiar strains of Handel's Messiah. I sometimes jokingly dissuade people from saying nice things about me, it happens occasionally, because it will only feed into my Messiah complex. And I think we generally know that what the word Messiah means. Literally, it's translated as anointed one. And it refers to someone who is a savior or liberator of a group of people. For us, Jesus is that savior. The anointed one of God who has come to his people and set us free from the bondage of sin and death. The Greek translation of Messiah is Christos, or Christ. So every time we invoke the name Jesus Christ, we are calling upon Jesus the Messiah, our Savior and Redeemer. Of course, Christ is not, as we all thought in Sunday school, Jesus' last name. His parents were not named Mary and Jesus Christ. The neighbors didn't talk about inviting the Christs over for dinner next Friday. But it's important, I think, to dig a little deeper into this concept of Messiah, because Peter's declaration in this morning's gospel passage is critical to our understanding of Jesus' identity. In response to Jesus' question, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter, for the first time by anyone in the Bible, proclaims that Jesus is the Messiah. After all the teachings and healings and miracles, Peter finally gets it. He comprehends that Jesus isn't just an inspiring teacher or someone with a few tricks up his sleeve. He declares unequivocally, it's in there somewhere, that Jesus is the Messiah, the anointed one of God, the Christ. Now, Peter being Peter, in other words, painfully human, he still doesn't fully understand what this means. In fact, in the immediate aftermath of his declaration, Jesus sternly orders him and all the disciples not to tell anyone that he is the Messiah. Which seems awfully peculiar, doesn't it? You'd think that once they finally understood the fullness of Jesus' identity, he'd encourage them to shout it from the rooftops. I mean, Jesus came into the world to declare that God's kingdom was at hand, to share the message of salvation for all people. Why would he suddenly tell them to keep quiet about this incredible revelation? This so-called messianic secret, which Susan mentioned and talked about in her sermon last week, and that is on full display for us this morning, is just so curious. Until you realize that while Peter utters the word and declares that Jesus is the Messiah, he certainly doesn't understand the full implications here. In fairness, no one could. At this point, the disciples themselves had only a partial view. They had the right word. They were heading in the right direction. But only after Jesus' resurrection would they see the full picture of what it means to be God's Messiah. And so Jesus didn't want them spreading news that people would misunderstand or misconstrue. Indeed, for Peter, for the disciples, and most Jews, The concept of a Messiah often referred to a militaristic political figure who would overthrow the Roman authority and establish a new kingdom on earth. When they dreamed of a Messiah, they were likely anticipating someone who would swoop in and suddenly bring about regime change with a single dramatic act. Something that, in an instant, would flip the world order on its head and change their lives forever. That's what they envisioned and longed for. They certainly weren't thinking about a figure who would, as Jesus explained, undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. When it came to all the hopes and expectations they placed upon the coming Messiah, suffering, rejection, and death is not really what they had in mind at all. Now, the whole idea of the messianic secret is predicated on the fact that one single dramatic act would change the world. The kicker, though, is that it would not be a spectacular battle or an earth-shattering natural disaster, but the cross. And before Christ's passion, before the empty tomb, before Christ's resurrection, no one could have possibly understood the full implications of this one single dramatic act of love. No one could comprehend that the bonds of sin and death would be forever broken by the broken body of Jesus Christ. No one could fathom that the cross was the one single dramatic act of God's Messiah, who was sent into the world to redeem us, to save us from ourselves, and to fill us with that sense of peace and joy that the world cannot give. So the expectations of what people projected upon the coming Messiah did not mesh with the reality of God's Messiah. Jesus' kingdom was not limited to this world. And so the wider population was simply not ready to hear that Jesus was the Messiah. They wouldn't get it. They couldn't get it. And so we end up with this situation where Jesus acknowledges that Peter's declaration is true, but commands him not to tell anybody else. Once the messianic cat is out of the bag, however, the whole tenor of Mark's gospel takes a turn. Suddenly the cross looms over the rest of the story. In a word, things get real. And in light of this, we must also get real about our faith. We must answer the same question addressed to the disciples. Jesus looks directly into your eyes, lovingly gazing into your very soul, and asks you, "Who do you say that I am?" It's the fundamental question of life. A question you can't dodge or evade if you genuinely seek to follow Jesus Christ. So who do you say that Jesus is? There are all sorts of possible answers. Safe answers. A nice guy. A great moral teacher. Someone I'm happy to spend an hour with every week or so. And there's some truth here. But this doesn't come close to the fullness of the only possible answer. You are the Messiah. Because when that's our answer, we hand over our lives to Jesus. We admit that we are not in control. We admit that we can't carry our burdens alone. We admit that life has more depth and meaning than what we see on the surface. And suddenly, we are set free, and our lives are handed over to Jesus. The good news is that this question isn't asked just once and for all. It is asked of us daily, lovingly, and throughout our lives. Who do you say that I am? Ultimately, it is a question of identity. We must know Jesus' identity as the Messiah in order to let him fully shape our own identity. And this takes time. Discipleship, following Jesus, it's a journey. It's no accident that Jesus asks this question of the disciples while they're on the road, walking together. We may not always give the right answer on any given day, but we do know the answer. And day by day, in our daily walk with Jesus, we must move ever deeper into the reality of what we know to be true. The declaration that you are the Messiah.